I would like to welcome you to this conversation that I get to have with Nancy Wilson. Let me tell you a little bit about Nancy, and you can sit if you want. Let's go ahead and do that. Nancy is the founder and owner of Wilson Counseling. She's a licensed professional counselor who's been in practice for over 20 years. She's committed to making the therapy room a place where people feel safe to explore the brokenness they experience in life and find healing. I think that's beautiful. She believes that just as pain and trauma come through relationships, healing can also come through relationships. She has been married for 25 years. She and her husband have 3 teenage daughters who keep them busy. And Nancy is a longtime member of City Church. It is a delight to welcome you. Please show your appreciation for Nancy being here. Now, I have a series of questions that I'm going to ask, but we also want you to have an opportunity to ask questions. We have the option, and I'm just now realizing we don't have a way to put these up, but just write this down if you're interested in texting a question, and one of our staff members will retrieve it and filter them to me. So here is the number. It's 713-489-8918. Let me say that again, 713-489-8918. We'll also give an opportunity for people to ask questions from the floor, but realizing these are sensitive and important subjects, and sometimes it might feel more comfortable for you to anonymously text a question. It's not going to any person's cell phone. It's to the same number. In the service we say you can text your name to this phone, and we'll have a staff member follow up. You can just text your question to it, okay? Now let me frame this. I've already done this in the service, but in case you just happen to be joining us, what precipitated this conversation is, many months ago when our staff team was imagining this fall sermon series, the great, spiritual leaders of the first book of the Bible, the foundational family, and you step back and you look at them and you go, oh my gosh, these are seriously dysfunctional people. And yet, as someone told me years ago, if it weren't for dysfunctional families, there may not be any families listed in the Bible. Just think of a family. David's family. Ooh, no, don't go there. That's pretty bad. Even Jesus. Do you know at one point Jesus, in the height of his ministry, is speaking to a group, and it says, Mark tells us, that his family has gathered outside because they think he's gone crazy. Okay? So if Jesus came from a family with, let's just say, some complicated dynamics, then it should make each one of us feel like, okay, I'm not the only one. So then, and that's where this conversation comes in, it's sort of like, how do we begin to make sense of it and see it not just as an opportunity to extricate ourselves from our families or to blame family members, but how do we actually grow through this? So, with that in mind, Nancy, welcome. Why don't we begin by you talking a little bit about family of origin. Why does this stuff matter? Why should we rehash the past? Can't we just move on and deal with the here and now?
So, I wish that you could just leave the past in the past, but the past always comes alive in the present. Whether you recognize it or not, there are patterns that you learned, there are, wounds that you have from your family of origin. They affect how you see yourself, they affect how you treat people in your family and in your life. And so, really, the question isn't whether or not we need to rehash the past. The question is, do you want to be somebody who lives in an intentional way, who understands how their past affects them, and can learn to manage some of those wounds, can learn to heal from some of those wounds, so that you can be a person that, lives more thoughtfully, lives more fully their calling and what God wants you to do, instead of just having knee-jerk reactions and kind of leaving the wounds on the battlefield in all of the relationships around you.
Nancy, will you talk a little bit about attachment theory and how it can affect a person's well-being?
Yeah. Okay, so we're going to talk theory real quick. It will be like a 1-minute introduction to this idea of attachment theory. And I want to bring it up because I think if you understand, the early wounds that you had or things that happened in your past, you are going to be able to be so much more patient and loving with yourself and so much more patient and loving with the people in your lives. Sorry, y'all. We're just going to roll with it. Anyways, okay, so attachment theory. The idea is that your early attachments growing up created like a set of rules for how you see all relationships in the future. So you either had secure attachments or insecure attachments. And frankly, most of you will have had insecure attachments. It's just the truth. Even if you came from really loving, beautiful Christian families who tried really hard and did the best they could, there were things that happened in your lives growing up and in your families that made you feel othered, that made you feel like you weren't quite right. There were parts of yourself maybe you should hide or you felt shameful about. And so I want to talk about the two kinds of insecure attachments really quickly, and then we can talk about examples of what does that even mean? Why does it matter? So the two primary types of what we call insecure attachments are anxious and avoidant. And I want you to listen to see if this fits maybe who you are and how you handle conflict in your relationships. So the first one is anxious. People who have anxious attachments, they worry a lot about rejection and abandonment. They may come across as really needy, especially when there's conflict. They want a lot of reassurance. People who are avoidant, on the other hand, they have a lot of trouble letting people in. They just don't trust people. They don't want people to be close because people don't feel safe. And so I'm going to give you guys an example from my life. My husband gave me permission to talk about our relationship. He said he's an open book. So here it is. My sweet husband is very avoidant. His philosophy of life is if you avoid a problem, it'll go away. P.S. Not true.
It doesn't?
It does not go away. So when we are interacting, especially if we have conflict, he goes into his anxious, did I say he was avoidant? He is avoidant sometimes, but he's very anxious. He starts to feel kind of insecure, and he needs a lot of reassurance, and he's worried that, I'm not going to be loving or sweet to him, and that is really distressing. And for me, if we have conflict, I become very avoidant. I just want to crawl into my hole, be by myself for a while, think about things, and that creates this unhealthy pattern of, feeling like he's not going to feel happy until we are back in a good place, but I can't do that right away. So one thing I have learned is that it's really important for my anxious husband that I just reassure him from the get-go, and I just say, I'm upset, and I love you, and we'll talk about it when I've had time to think about it. So let's talk later today. And then that anxious attachment, he can start to feel secure again. So you see in that relationship where he can go from being in a really insecure place, a really anxious place, to getting to a point of maybe his attachment feeling a little bit more secure, just based on even how I speak with him. Versus if I just clam up, I'm sure a lot of y'all have done that. You get really upset with your partner and you just clam up and you're like, I can't do this, I can't deal with this. Just leave me alone for a while. That can be really distressing for someone who's anxious because they start to feel abandoned, they start to feel rejected, and then they may come across as very needy to you. So that's just a specific example to kind of show you how some of these early attachments and things that probably happened in my home, in his home, have affected how we interact with one another. And me pretending like the past is in the past doesn't make it better. But me recognizing this is what's going on with me, and this is how I can be the best version of myself in order to love my husband well, is the way you get to healing.
How early in a person's life can these dynamics form?
I mean, even before you have conscious memories, because we know now that a lot of trauma happens even before you can remember the trauma. And so this can happen when you're a baby. Maybe you didn't get enough affection or attention, but it can also happen all throughout your family. And you can have wounds that happen beyond your family of origin, but today we're focusing on what are those things that happen early on. A lot of our brain development happens in those first 3 years, and so a lot of how we see the world, our set of rules of like, is the world a safe place? Can I trust people? Those are things that start very early on in life.
That's kind of overwhelming, right? I mean, what, for those who are parents or may one day be a parent, do you have any coaching tips so you don't, because you're thinking, oh gosh, am I going to screw up my children, or what do I do now that I have, that sort of thing?
Absolutely. And I'm glad you asked that, Leo, because one of the things that I want to make sure you guys understand is this is not about blaming parents. Parenting is one of the hardest, if not the hardest job that you will ever do. Almost anything you do could, make your child feel like there's a part of them that isn't good or isn't okay, and you don't mean that. Like, we're doing the best we can as parents. But what I would say is just focusing on not whether or not you're going to wound your child, because you will. We are all living in a broken world. We are broken. We have our own insecurities and problems we bring to the relationship. But what do you do with the repair? What do you do to make up, with your child, with your spouse, with your coworker, whatever it is? Really admitting, I don't like how I treated you. I don't like that I yelled at you earlier, or whatever it was. And I bet that really hurt your feelings. Can we talk about it? And just coming back, and this can be years later. You may not realize until your kids are a little bit older, man, that really messed up my child. Like when my kid was, I'm not talking about me personally, but let's just say I had a kid who was, maybe they really loved to eat, and they were a little on the chubby side, and I might have said, hey, do you really want to keep eating that? You really should go exercise. Maybe you should pay attention to your weight. And they internalize that as my body is bad, I'm bad. That might turn into just feeling shame about their body, or it could turn into an eating disorder, who knows. But what you want to do is come back when you realize those things I said kind of hurt my child. You can go back. There is healing after the fact. So you can go back and say, I realize now what I said was really unkind, and it probably made you feel like I didn't accept you or love you, and I want you to know that I feel really sorry about that, and I think you're amazing. And just do that repair with the people in your lives, because it can start the healing process. You don't have to get it right the first time.
Let's talk about some hypothetical situations that adults deal with. Let's say that you have a difficult time with intimacy with other people. How might getting into therapy, understanding better your family of origin, how might that help you understand why that's such a difficult thing for you?
There's a really good chance that your problems that you have with being intimate with people, whether that's physical intimacy or emotional intimacy, they probably did come from early attachment wounds that you had growing up. And you may come across as being very cold sometimes to people, or avoidant. You may not even physically like to be touched. But if you can understand where that came from, you can start to change that. You can learn that, through a healthy relationship, for example. Like if you grew up in a very critical household, you may not feel very comfortable being honest about yourself and the parts of yourself that you don't feel great about. But if you're with a loving partner, they can really help heal that wound. And you can also do the same thing in the therapy room. You can understand, this is why I am the way that I am, and these are the tools that I can use to start feeling comfortable with myself, so that I can feel comfortable with my partner, so that I can feel comfortable being open, being intimate, because the people in your life know when you're not willing to open up. And you never really have closeness with people if you can't be intimate with them. So I think it's really important. And I'll say one more thing, not to go too long, but I've worked with a lot of clients who would say that they are Christians, and I cannot tell you how many of them feel that God doesn't love them. They know that God is loving, and they know that the Bible talks about God's love, but they personally, and I would say this is more of them than not, have trouble really accepting God's unconditional love. I think part of it is because of these attachment wounds. They don't feel like they're lovable because they didn't always feel loved in the families they grew up in. And I think that really translates. The way we saw our parents is the way we often see God. And so as you heal and you learn to love yourself, accept yourself, even with all the flaws, I think you can be a lot more open to accepting God's love too. And that outpouring can allow you to be a more loving person to everyone you encounter.
If you have a friend or a partner that, as you get to know them, either because they share it with you or you just sense that they have, I guess due to attachment theory dynamics, that they have a fear of abandonment. How can you be a friend? How can you be a good lover to that person?
Part of it is just by being consistent in your relationships, caring for somebody, showing up for them, living in community the way we often talk about in Christian circles. And part of it is about not being judgmental towards them, being curious why, instead of being judgmental about things that your friend does or your partner does that you don't like, just asking I wonder why that is. Where might they be coming from? What is that about? And if you can come at them with curiosity and love instead of judgment, they start to feel accepted. And that's part of the process that heals, I think, some of these wounds. Because you're not abandoning them. You're showing up, even when they're being a jerk, right? Or even when they're struggling and they're in pain, you're still there. That all brings healing.
I love that. Approaching it, that relationship from the standpoint of curiosity. It sounds very healthy. Can you talk a little bit, Nancy, about what healthiness looks like? If you're growing as a human being, if you would describe yourself as a Christian, growing as a Christian, what does that look like? How do you even get your mind around? Because some of us are more perfectionistic in orientation, and so it can always feel like 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. So what does growth, healthiness even look like?
There's a verse in Romans 7, I don't know, have it memorized, but basically it's Paul saying, the things that I want to do, I don't do, and the things that I do, that I hate, those are the things that I do. Have you ever thought about why we do that?
Have you been reading my diary? What are you talking about?
Yeah, exactly. That's all of us. So I think part of this growth process is about learning how to actually do the things that we want to do, not because we feel like if we're not perfect, God won't love us, or if we don't perform, we don't have value, or if we don't keep loving people and caregiving, we're going to lose the people in our lives. There's that orientation I think we have that we always have to perform, and it's exhausting. And so that often drives us to do things that aren't healthy. We do things in our lives that we then become resentful of. I might do things for my spouse, but then be really annoyed that I had to do it because I'm not really doing it out of a healthy place. I'm not what we would call differentiated, right? I'm so enmeshed, I'm so driven by the need to please and the need to have other people approve of me that I just keep doing things, and I would say that's pretty unhealthy. So learning how to be kind of like Jesus, if you think about the example of when Jesus was on earth, he loved people well. He didn't want to make people angry, but he did make people angry a lot because he understood that these are my values, this is my mission, this is what I'm called to, and I'm going to live out a life based on my conscience and based on my values. And so I think learning to be stronger in and of yourself so you can live based on what you believe and your conscience will make you a healthier, more differentiated person. And that's hard. That is way easier said than done. It is a process and it takes a lot of work, but you can get there.
That's good. That's very good. What cautions would you coach us with in terms of, as you can imagine, you start to get into this in therapy, family of origin dynamics, and revelations happen. There's epiphanies, and they can be dark epiphanies. How do you approach that in a healthy and responsible way so that, it doesn't become something where you're living the rest of your life bitter and angry toward one of your family members or several of them?
It's really easy to be bitter and to blame other people, and that's definitely not what we're talking about here today, but it just comes up. When you're angry about things that have happened to you in your past, you want to discharge that anger, and it'll come out at whoever is near you, I think, sometimes. But I really encourage you to practice compassion, and that is a practice, just like anything else that you can get used to and understanding. My parents did the best that they could, and that thing they did, it really hurt me. But I can be kind toward them because I know that, that they meant well, and there was a lot of love in that. And even if somebody didn't mean well, I know that if I'm going to be a compassionate person, I'm just going to be a happier person. Maybe what that person did to me was really terrible. And I can be really angry about it, and it makes sense to hold that anger because sometimes we need to protect our hearts a little bit. But I'm not going to let it control me, because otherwise that's what you're living out of, and you're going to live a pretty bitter and unhappy life. So I think practicing compassion, practicing gratitude, where you learn to say, my family was really complicated and they messed me up in some ways, but these are the things I'm really grateful for. Sometimes just focusing on the good things allows us to lighten the load of all the really hard things too. But don't be afraid to seek out a therapist. You're not supposed to be able to do life on your own. Everyone in this room, you have missing pieces of the puzzle that you don't understand. Why am I like this? Why do I do what I do? If you're struggling with bitterness, schedule an appointment with a therapist. I know you can talk to anyone on staff, and they probably have people that they can recommend. But they will give you the tools. The therapist will give you the tools and walk you through the process of letting go of that pain and learning to heal.
Nancy, why do you think within particularly more conservative Christian subculture, there is often there's an inhibition about pursuing therapy because it's an admission that you don't have it all together? Oh, you're one of those people. It's interesting, one of the cultural differences Ellen and I noticed having lived in New York, it's almost illegal in New York not to be in therapy. It's seen as a sign of a mature, intelligent, healthy person. But there's a lot of reluctance to do that maybe in Houston, Texas, Christian culture.
Yeah, I don't know. I think some of that maybe just comes from a mistrust of secular things in general. But, look, we serve a big God. He's the God of science. He is, he's the God of everything. And if your spouse or your child or someone you loved got cancer, you wouldn't suddenly say, God will heal you. It's all good, no problem, right? You would find the best oncologist you could, and you would seek out treatment. And so I believe that God heals people through everything he has made, and he has gifted people who know how to help you heal emotionally, not just physically. And so, it makes sense to trust God in that process, that he can bring those people into your life, because he's a big God. He's not a God who is just limited to some supernatural way of healing you. Sometimes that happens, but he usually heals us and cares for us through the people in our lives. And that's true of counseling too.
Very, very helpful. And it's not just limited to modern Houston culture, of course. I mean, Jesus looked at the religious leaders of his day and at one point called them whitewashed tombs. Just think of that metaphor. They sparkle on the outside. What was happening? They were merely engaged in behavioral modification on the exterior. They weren't dealing with the internal. It reminds me of that line from the movie Shrek, one of the great theologians of our day who's, said, donkey, ogres have layers, or onions have layers, ogres have layers. Every human being is like an onion. We have all these layers to us, but we're not really good, in my opinion, at pulling back those layers on our own. And how wonderful to have people who are actually trained, skilled professionally, have competencies to help us, like Nancy. And we're so fortunate at City Church to have many people in the mental health industry. All right, I'm going to now open it up. I have more questions, but I imagine by now some of you have generated some questions for Nancy. Do we have a question over here, Elise? Okay. Sure. This is Elise Miller.
Okay, thinking about upcoming holidays and family gatherings, how can we start forming healthier boundaries with our parents and family members? What are some things to keep in mind as we talk and relate to them in person?
Yeah, that's a great question. This is a very triggering time of year because I think even you talked today about Jesus and the people that he grew up with had the hardest time really, I think, trusting him and respecting him. And it's kind of like that for us too, right? When we go back to our families of origin, there's all kinds of stuff that comes up. And as the person who asked the question pointed out, boundaries are really helpful. So before you have family gatherings, you may be traveling for that or they may be in this town, think about what am I okay talking about and not talking about. If you have people in your lives, family members who bring up stuff that is really triggering or distressing to you, you don't have to have those conversations. You don't have to play the game that they're playing, so to speak. You can say, I'm not really comfortable talking about that, so why don't we talk about something else, for example? Or say you're going to be traveling and every time you go visit your family, you just get really overwhelmed and anxious and there's a fight. You may need to set your own boundaries and say, I'm going to take some time away every day to, I'm going to take some time to pray. I'm going to take some time to exercise, to meditate. Whatever the boundary is that you need to be healthy in those spaces, don't be afraid to do it.
Do you have a book or podcast or resource on boundaries that you recommend?
I think the go-to book for most Christians is the Townsend
Henry Cloud
Townsend book. I think it's pretty good, and there's 100 proliferations of all the varieties of it. But I think the thing about Christians when they struggle with boundaries is that we often feel like it's selfish to set boundaries. It's not okay for me to take care of myself or make sure I'm in a good place. But the truth is it is not selfish. Jesus took time away to pray. God gave us the Sabbath rest. We need those boundaries. We need that time to recharge and reset. And so you're going to be a better person. You're going to be more loving. You're going to be more clear-headed and really be able to live out your calling more if you learn to set boundaries.
Wonderful. What about from the floor? A question that comes to mind that you'd like to have Nancy interact with? It's always the first one. It's priming the pump that's the most difficult. So I'm just going to sit here for a second. Amber Blossom, thank you for being that courageous first.
The question is if you're already on your own healing journey and you are in a relationship with somebody else who could really use that healing, how do you talk to them about that, or how do you encourage them to do that? Yeah, especially if they've never been in counseling or, have never been a part of that process. I think it depends on your relationship with them. How close are you? How much do they trust you? But in general, you can't make someone get help who doesn't want to get help, first of all. So, don't take on too much of that burden. But what I would say is I often share my own experience. These are the ways in which I've struggled. These are the ways in which counseling has been helpful to me because it normalizes it and makes it okay for everybody else to say, okay, I do need help, right? I do need help, and to be healthy, that may involve seeking, a professional therapist. And so sometimes when you just normalize it for them and you let them know, like, this was a really good thing for me, this is how it affected my life. You may even pass along the name of a therapist that you trust or something like that. They may be a little bit more open to the conversation, but I think it's really important that you put it out there and then let them make the decision and don't become resentful if they don't follow through with it. A lot of people have to think about this 5, 6, 10 times before they will call a therapist. It can be kind of scary. Like, what are we doing? What is this process? I'm going to be opening up to a stranger. I think that's hard for a lot of people. And usually, hopefully it's a good process once you get there. But, put it out there, be gentle about it. Now, if it's someone closer to you, if this is your spouse, for example, all of those things are still true, but you have a little bit more sway with them. So I would be really clear about, it's really important for me that you consider talking to a therapist because we have this interaction that isn't working, or there's this thing that you're bringing to the relationship that's really hurtful to me, and it would mean a lot to me if you would talk to somebody about that. You can be a little bolder when it's your spouse or your partner. I don't think you can do that with most people, though. You just have to kind of explain what you've gone through and hope that they'll be willing to take that leap of faith and do it for themselves.
Let's talk for a second about conflict and conflict resolution. This could be in just a friendship or in a marriage. It could be within a family, different individuals in the family. You have one person that sometimes I refer to it as they have the gift of confrontation. You know people like that? Yep. They spot something that's a flaw in you or your relationship, and they're going to address it head on. The other person, maybe this is you, is freaked out by conflict. And so they close up or run away. They don't know what to do with it. Do family of origin dynamics, are they connected to those issues? And how do we begin to deal with that kind of a difference in a relationship?
So are you asking about the difference between in a relationship, particularly where one person is very comfortable with conflict and you're
Yes.
uncomfortable with conflict?
You said that more efficiently than I did.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, that's quite a common dynamic. So the question is, how do you deal with it? It is tricky. So I'll give you the example of a couple that I know. The husband grew up in a very, let's just say, a household where the father was very critical, angry, almost emotionally abusive. He was trying to motivate his son, but a lot of it was like, you're never going to amount to anything if you don't get better grades or do this. And so he learned to be very, very conflict avoidant. And his spouse is the opposite. She's like kind of a go-getter. She's always seeking out, like, we're going to fix things. We're going to do things. So she will bring up every problem. I think confrontation in some ways feels like emotional intimacy to her because that's what she was used to in her family growing up. And so, like, that debate and that conflict feels like love to her. But I think what they had to learn to do is do counseling on their own, honestly, so that they could get to the point where she's able to understand that her style of bringing up her concerns is really triggering for her partner. And he had to learn that, this can be a safe environment for me to open up if I just feel better about myself. But they had to learn to do conflict differently because that pattern is just going to keep repeating over and over. And, you will become more and more estranged from your partner if you let that continue. You just will not feel safe and comfortable in an environment like that.
You've alluded to how very early on, but it can happen at any point in a person's life, there can be an event that triggers shame that people deal with throughout their life. You and I offline interacted on something called internal family systems. I don't know if you want to go there, but I found, as I listened to a couple podcasts you sent me, I found it fascinating to think through internal family systems as it pertained to the issue of shame?
Yeah, it's a big topic, but the idea behind what Leo's talking about is that we have different parts of ourselves, right? And there are parts of ourselves that we don't feel good about. I've kind of talked about that a little bit. And so we may exile those parts of ourselves. So I may not show other people, my really angry side, even though I may be somebody who does struggle with anger and frustration. And I just hide that part of me because I feel ashamed of it. And so I learn to close myself off and not be my true self with other people. Or let's say you're a person who struggles with addiction of any kind. That may be because you have a part of yourself that addiction is helping you manage, basically. You're so overwhelmed by things going on in your life that you learn that, if I drink enough or, whatever it is, the addiction may be an eating disorder, it may be porn addiction. There's all kinds of addictions, right? But that can help me numb out. And it's not because I want to be a bad person, You're just trying to survive most of the time with a lot of this stuff. But there's a part of you that's that there's this shameful part of you or this upset part of you. And so what they call the manager part is going to take over and say, why don't you just numb out and you don't have to think about it? Or why don't you do everything perfectly? Why don't you be the best pastor ever? And everyone will think you're amazing. And if you do that, Ellen.
My wife is the one that broke out in laughter. Do you have any availability this week, Nancy?
But it's true, right? Sometimes I feel for Leo. That's such a hard job. Everybody's looking at you all the time. But there must be this sense of I better be really perfect and really good at my job or they're going to boot me. They're going to, they're not going to want me to be their pastor. They're going to go to a new church, right? So you overperform. There's that, that manager part of you that's I'm going to do everything well and I'm going to give the best sermons and I'm not going to show weakness because that's shameful. And so we're complicated. There's all these different parts of us. And so I think part of what we're learning to do as healthy people is become integrated. We don't want to live these really separate lives where, this perfectionistic part of me is having to manage everything else because I can't be honest about the fact that I feel insecure or that I struggle with whatever the problems happen to be. It's just learning to say yeah, I'm broken and I have these struggles and that's okay because I'm working on it.
And remind me because I think one of the interesting things here is oftentimes, again, in conservative Christian subculture, behaviors, that are shameful are addressed merely as that behavior, the external behavior, and it just exacerbates the shame rather than appreciating with this paradigm of internal family system that we are these different parts that maybe that behavior is there as a coping mechanism, like you're saying, a numbing the pain doesn't make the behavior okay. It's just that there's more layers. It's more complicated, and growth means that we're not just dealing with the external behavior, we're tracing it down to its root. Is that right?
That's exactly right. And part of the problem with only dealing with behaviors and not understanding where they came from, it's like whack-a-mole. I deal with this working with people with eating disorders all the time where it's okay, maybe you're no longer binge eating, but now maybe you start drinking too much or whatever it is because you're just looking for a way to cope. And if you don't deal with the pain that caused the need for you to cope in the first place, another mole's going to come up.
You might clean up that one area and think, oh, I've checked that box, but you're not really dealing with...
Yeah. And shame is so problematic because it tells you, you're messed up, everything's messed up, just hide all of it. Let's just whitewash it. We'll be whitewashed tombs and then we'll be fine. No one will ever know. And it really discourages you from understanding where all that came from and just being a little bit loving and curious and kind to yourself, which is what most of us need. If you can say, man, I went through that, that struggle when I was a kid growing up. I had that abuse incident or I had that, parent who was really critical, and now sometimes I have a really hard time with whatever it is. And if you can have that love and compassion for yourself and be curious about why you do what you do, it really starts to melt away so much of the shame, and you don't necessarily need all those acting out behaviors as much as you used to.
How do you grow in that? If someone is really wrestling with self-loathing, what are some practical tips that you might encourage them to do?
I usually do self-compassion exercises, which we talked about earlier, but self-compassion is just learning to be kind to yourself. So, and that might be as simple as just saying, this is really hard. What I'm struggling with is really hard. Instead of saying, what's wrong with me? Why am I such a screw up? Why do I always mess things up? You can hear that critical voice, right? You guys probably all do it. But that critical voice just brings up the shame. Whereas that voice of kindness, especially the more you practice it, it's just a way of saying, I'm loved and I'm lovable, and I can still, I can still sin and have problems, and that's all okay, because I'm going to keep working on it. I am free. I am loved and I am free, so I can work on my problems. I'm not going to work on my problems because I suck and I'm a bad person and I'm a shameful person. It does not motivate you. You may think shame motivates you, but it will not. It will make you feel stuck. So I really want people to feel liberated.
Yeah, and I am coming back to you in just a second, but I think that's so helpful, and it just struck me as you're saying that. I mean, even if we don't feel it, like you might hear what Nancy's saying and go, oh my gosh, no, I am such an awful person. I could never exercise self-compassion, but the gospel is our greatest medicine there, right? Because the Lord has loved us with an everlasting love in Christ. There's one place in Psalms where it says that he has kissed us, in his righteousness and love. And so maybe it's developing some spiritual practices where that idea, I think for a lot of us, the gospel remains kind of this cognitive idea out there, but pulling it down into the experiential. For me, any progress I have in this comes from prayerful meditation and getting that into the experience. Ellen's father had a practice that I've tried to incorporate, though I'm not nearly as effectively as he would do, but where he would take a passage and memorize it, meditate on it, and then actually begin to say it prayerfully as though God is speaking it to him about his love and compassion, so that it begins to,
Yeah, it's in your soul. Yeah. And that's something I work with a lot of clients, especially my Christian clients, is they will pick verses from the Bible where they feel that God's love is speaking directly to them. And then they might do like a deep breathing exercise so they're in a peaceful, calm place, kind of like what you were talking about. And then just visualizing God being there with you. Maybe he's sitting next to you, or you're sitting in his lap, or he's putting his arms around you. Whatever visual helps you to really experience God in the present. And then just reciting those scripture verses. You're not trying to convince yourself of anything so much as it is just existing in the love that God already has for you, that we know is there. Because so often we say that God is loving, but we don't act like it and we don't feel it because that shame has pushed out God's voice.
That's good. Elise.
Okay, the first question, can childhood attachment issues be resolved when you are not speaking to the parent that has emotionally injured you? If possible, is it a good idea to reach out and try to reconnect with the distant parent?
Absolutely, you do not need to be in touch with the parent for you to have healing. And there may be circumstances where it's more dangerous or harmful for you to reach out to that parent. If you grew up in an abusive home and you have a parent, for example, who still is very triggering, they are not repentant, and it just seems to break down every time you try to talk to them, it may be better just to keep a boundary with them. And the healing will come in other relationships, through your partner, through a therapist, through friends who love you, through your church community. So you don't necessarily need to necessarily need to be in touch with that parent. Now, if you have a parent who's loving, they're trying to do the best they can now, they've even repented of that, that can be very healing too. So you don't need to cut your parents out, but you also don't need them in order to heal from those attachment wounds.
Great question. I see a question back there, and then I'll come back to you. Yes?
So the question was, in an adopted family, I want to make sure I get your question right. In an adopted family, what can you do to create secure attachments? Is that the question? Yeah, so adoption is really interesting because there can be wounds that happen really early on, even when the kids, are not conscious, like we talked about. And very often there are some attachment wounds with adopted kids. So there are some differences, but mostly it's quite similar to anything that any other parent would be doing. You just keep showing up like you clearly are. You reassure your child. When there are behaviors, you want to address the behavior, but explain that they're loved regardless of the behavior. So, I think you're going to wound your kids, adopted kids, non-adopted kids. I mean, we all in relationships will wound each other to some extent. And I think it goes back to that repair. How do you make up with someone when there's been a bad interaction?
Thank you for the question, and thank you, Nancy, for interacting on it. I think I saw another hand go up. Yeah, Dave?
Yeah, so the question is, if you are in a relationship with somebody who is so problematic that, you've already extended forgiveness, you've already tried to work on the relationship, but it continues to be a problem, is it ever appropriate to cut off the relationship? Is that right? Yeah, absolutely. There are people in your life who you probably will want to and should cut off because you're not helping them staying in the relationship, most likely, and you are hurting yourself, so it's going to degrade your own mental health and your ability to really, have a full enough cup for you to do everything you need to do already, to be a loving spouse, or to be a good coworker, or to take care of things in your life, because you're just so worn out by those relationships. So there are times when it's just healthier to set the boundary. Yeah, and pray for them. You hope for them, but sometimes you have to let it go for a while until they're ready for more.
Got one more question from Elise.
How can you set a boundary with someone who needs therapy but refuses to get therapy, instead wants you to frequently spend hours and hours dealing with all their stuff, almost like you were their therapist?
All right, we are chuckling because everybody in this room probably has someone in their life like that. Yeah. So it's actually pretty simple how you deal with it. If you are willing to set that boundary, I'm going to assume this is maybe like a friend. Let's just say this is a friend who constantly is calling, they're really struggling, but they're just not dealing with their issues in therapy, and you're not their therapist. You're not trained, and your relationship is not sufficient to help them get to the next level to really be a healthy person or to be okay. I think that I would say something to the effect of, hey, I love you, and I know you've got a lot going on in this, in this part of your life or in this relationship, but I feel like we've developed a little bit of an unhealthy pattern where you share that with me, and and nothing seems to be helping because I just don't have the tools, and I really want to see you get to a better place because I love you. Have you thought about talking to a therapist? Or, and if they're like, I'm not going to talk to a therapist, or maybe one day, you can just say I think it's healthiest if we don't keep having this relationship. So if you bring it up, I'm going to let you know that I love you, but we should talk about something else. That's hard to do. Most of us don't like boundaries, and you know why? Because the other person will be mad at you when you set a boundary, and that feels bad. But the truth is you're enabling behavior that's really not healthy. You want to love them and be their friend, but it's not going anywhere. Yeah.
I feel like listening to you, Nancy, is like having this treasure chest of wisdom that there's all this stuff there, but we need to open it up and Here's one more gem, another jewel. It's been wonderful. Thank you so much. Please show your appreciation
Thank
for
you,
Nancy
guys.
Wilson. I want to thank our team, House of Blues, Brighton Gale City Church, who helped to organize and execute this event. If this has primed the pump for you and you think, okay, I probably need to, it would be good for me, it would be healthy for me to take a step in the direction of therapy, I imagine Nancy can help you with some resources. We also have curated a list at City Church of various counselors and therapists, and so happy to help. I will say what I imagine Clint says, whenever someone wants to get together with me, I say I am not a professional counselor or therapist. It's not in my wheelhouse. I'm a pastor. I do triage. I try to love on people, but just having a conversation like this with Nancy shows me, oh my goodness, the competencies, the contrast here is pretty acute. So thank you so much. Why don't I close our time in prayer and then you'll be dismissed. Father, thank you so much for the wisdom that we have heard today. I thank you for Nancy and the many individuals at City Church who do this for a living, who have given their life for this. I pray that you would bless them. It is not an easy job, to say the least. We pray that you would use what we have heard today, what we've thought about, to promote health, growth, strength in each of our lives and in the lives of each one we touch. And we give thanks through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen.